Today, we will be looking at 14 horrifying caving stories that went horribly wrong. Each story starts with confidence, but ends in chaos. One wrong turn, one mistake, one moment underground, and everything turns into unimaginable terror. As always, viewer discretion is advised. In the rolling hills of Tennessee, where limestone ridges hold countless secrets beneath their weathered surfaces, a small opening in the earth went largely unnoticed for generations. It wasn't marked on any maps. On Sunday, February 25th, 1973, this anonymous cave would become the setting for a drama that reveals the razor-thin margin between adventure and catastrophe. The cave itself is unremarkable from the outside, the sort of dark mouth in the hillside that might be mistaken for a fox den or dismissed as too insignificant for exploration. On this particular Sunday, two boys, Don, 17 years old, and his younger companion, decided to see what lay beyond that threshold. The first 50 feet offered no warning. The passage was straightforward enough, the kind of easy cave where simple stoop walking might encourage confidence in inexperienced explorers. The boys moved through this initial section with casualness. Then the cave changed its character entirely. What appeared before them was what spelunkers call a slot, a vertical crack in the rock, so narrow that even a slender person must turn sideways to enter. This wasn't the kind of obstacle you simply step over. This was the cave saying, turn back or commit completely. The boys chose to commit. The slot descended in a zigzag pattern, twisting through the limestone like a lightning bolt frozen in stone. 20 feet down, it opened into a crevice roughly 30 feet tall. Here, the limestone walls pressed close enough to touch both sides at once, creating that peculiar claustrophobia that only true cavers learn to embrace rather than fear. But the boys weren't true spelunkers, not yet. They had knowledge, the dangerous kind of partial knowledge acquired from mountaineering books and magazines. They had brought a rope, that much showed forethought. They'd even fashioned a crude anchoring system, tying their line to a small log they'd jammed into the upper part of the crevice. The physics seemed sound: wedge log and crack, tie rope to log, descend on rope. Simple. The older boy went first, using what they believed was proper technique, descending hand over hand, the rope running through what was either a carabiner wrap or a single brake bar setup. The exact configuration would later become a matter of investigation, one of those crucial details that separate successful adventure from preventable tragedy. At the bottom, approximately 60 feet down, the crevice yielded to several passages branching in different directions, like the fingers of an underground hand. The older boy called up. The way was clear. Don began his descent. In mountaineering, they say that ascending is harder than going down. Gravity works with you on the descent, making it deceptively easy. But in vertical caving, especially in narrow confines with inadequate equipment, this wisdom inverts. Going down is commitment. Coming back up requires strength, technique, and equipment that these boys simply didn't possess. Don reached the bottom. For a moment, perhaps, they felt the thrill of successful exploration. Two young adventurers who'd conquered a secret vertical passage. Then the older boy began his return journey. Climbing the rope proved difficult, more than difficult. Without proper ascending gear, without the Jumars or mechanical advantage systems that experienced explorers employ, hand-over-hand ascent of 60 feet of rope through a twisting zigzag crevice presented a challenge far beyond what their magazine-sourced knowledge had prepared them for. But the older boy had youth and determination on his side. After exhausting effort, he reached the constriction at the top of the pit. And there he stuck. The human body, for all its remarkable capabilities, was not designed to fit through 8-inch slots of rock while simultaneously pulling itself upward on a rope against gravity's insistent downward pull. For what must have felt like an eternity, he struggled in that stone vise, unable to advance, unable to retreat easily. Eventually, through some combination of technique, desperation, and sheer determination, he squeezed through. He called down to Don. Perhaps his voice carried a new understanding of what they had gotten themselves into. It was Don's turn to climb, but Don could not make the climb, whether from lack of strength, inadequate technique, or the simple reality that replicating his friend's desperate struggle was beyond his capabilities. He found himself stranded at the bottom. The rope hung before him like a vertical highway he couldn't travel. The passages around him led only deeper into the earth, not out toward sky and safety. What goes through a 17-year-old's mind when he realizes he's trapped underground? Don sat in the darkness, assuming they'd brought lights. He didn't panic. He didn't waste energy on futile climbing attempts. He conserved his strength and waited. Above ground, the older boy went for help. The Knox County Rescue Squad received the call, and they in turn contacted someone whose name would become central to this story: Jim Wilson, an experienced spelunker who understood the specialized demands of underground rescue. Wilson arrived to find a situation that tested every principle of careful caving. The vertical slot, so narrow that direct pulling was impossible. The zigzag nature of the descent, which meant any rescue attempt would have to account for multiple changes in direction. The improvised anchor point, that log wedged in the upper crevice, which might or might not hold under the stress of a rescue operation. And below all this technical complexity, a 17-year-old boy waited in the cold embrace of the earth. Connie Pierce, another caver of suitably slender build, joined Wilson at the cave. They assessed the situation with the methodical care that separates professional rescue from well-intentioned disaster. The belay line was attached to the purlon rope, not as the primary rescue tool, but as a safety measure in case that improvised log anchor failed. In cave rescue, you plan for every anchor to fail, and then you plan for what happens after that. Wilson rappelled into the pit. What he found wasn't the injured victim that rescue scenarios often prepare for, but something that could be equally dangerous. Don, uninjured but shivering uncontrollably, his body's core temperature dropping from prolonged immobility in the cave's constant cool temperature. The Earth maintains its temperature year-round, typically in the 50s Fahrenheit in Tennessee caves, which feels pleasant during initial exploration, but becomes dangerously cold over hours. They gave Don a denim jacket, the sort of detail that seems small in the retelling, but represented critical intervention against hypothermia. Wilson quickly rigged him into the rope using Jumars, proper mechanical ascending devices that work like one-way valves, gripping the rope on the upstroke, sliding free on the repositioning. This was the Mitchell system, named after its developer, a method that allowed even exhausted or injured cavers to ascend through self-belay. Don climbed. With proper equipment and technique, the 60-foot ascent that had seemed impossible now became merely difficult. The rope moved through his Jumars with reliable efficiency. His muscles, warmed by movement and perhaps fueled by the adrenaline of knowing rescue was at hand, powered him upward through the zigzagging crevice, until he reached the constriction where his friend had struggled hours earlier. Here, the physics that favor going down work against coming up. To pass through that 8-inch slot while attached to a rope, with ascending gear clipped to your harness, while tired and cold and fighting the body's natural tension against enclosed spaces, this is where technical knowledge becomes survival skill. 20 minutes. With Connie Pierce coaching from above, with Wilson presumably providing guidance from below, Don worked his way through that constriction. 20 minutes of incremental progress measured in inches, of breathing shallow and moving careful, of trusting equipment and technique over panic. And then he was through. After a brief rest, his first moment of true safety since beginning his descent many hours earlier, Don walked out of the cave under his own power. From the moment Knox County Rescue Squad received the initial call until Don emerged into February daylight, 6 hours had elapsed. Jim Wilson's report, following the rescue, displays the careful understatement characteristic of experienced cavers confronting near tragedy. Inexperience was the cause of the accident, but inexperience is rarely simple. The boys had knowledge. They'd studied rope work from mountaineering sources. They'd attempted to set a proper anchor. They'd even brought appropriate rope. What they lacked wasn't information, but context. They knew techniques without understanding the cave-specific applications that make those techniques survivable. What saved Don wasn't luck, though fortune certainly played its role. What saved him was the slender margin between partial knowledge and complete ignorance, between youth strength and total exhaustion, between a cave barely possible to rescue from, and one absolutely impossible. The rain began precisely when it shouldn't have, at 8 p.m. on a Saturday evening in September, as three prepared their gear at the cars parked near Castle Cave in Pocahontas County, West Virginia. Mary Schmidt, Mike Masterman, and Todd Leonhardt had planned a through trip, entering via the pit entrance and exiting through Windy Entrance, a 6-hour journey through one of West Virginia's celebrated vertical caves. They expected darkness, cold, and physical challenge. What they didn't expect was how quickly a light rain could transform their adventure into a cascading series of errors. The rain intensified as they suited up, transforming from drizzle to downpour with the capricious speed that mountain weather commands. Water found every seam in their clothing, every gap in their preparation. By the time Leonhardt, the last to enter, began his rappel into the earth, he was completely soaked. The rope ran slick through his descender as he dropped into the pit, water streaming around him, the cave's entrance shaft becoming a vertical river. At the bottom of the entrance pit, Leonhardt stood shivering. The cold had penetrated to his core, that deep bone-level chill that signals the body's losing battle with heat loss. He performed the calculation that experienced cave explorers learned to make instinctively. Current condition versus required exertion versus available resources. The math was simple and unforgiving. He was soaked, hadn't slept in approximately 36 hours, and faced 6 hours of strenuous caving. The equation pointed toward a single answer. Hypothermia was not a possibility, but a probability. Bag the trip, ascend, and call it a night, Leonhardt announced. Schmidt and Masterman agreed. It was the right decision, the kind of mature judgment that separates experience from reckless ones. They would retreat, dry off, perhaps try another day when conditions favored success rather than survival. What happened next reveals how the correct decision can still lead to catastrophe when execution fails. Masterman volunteered to climb first, a logical choice, as he could then assist Leonhardt over the lip at the top if fatigue or cold made that final obstacle difficult. He clipped his ascenders to the rope and began the climb out of the 415-foot entrance shaft, his mechanical devices gripping and releasing with each upward step. 10 feet up, he stopped. "I'm tired," he called down. The day had already extracted its toll. He'd spent the morning helping install a barn roof, physical labor that left muscles depleted before the cave work even began. His ascending system felt wrong, the adjustment slightly off, the efficiency reduced. What should have been rhythmic progress became labored struggle. Schmidt and Leonhardt made the obvious suggestion. Change over to rappel, descend, reassess. A simple procedure that any vertical cave explorer should be able to perform almost unconsciously. Remove ascenders, attach descender, weight the descender, unweight and remove ascenders completely, descend. The mechanical sequence that stands between a person and the ground, practiced until it becomes muscle memory. But muscle memory fails when conditions deteriorate. Masterman rigged his figure-8 descender and attempted the changeover. The torrential rain had achieved what rain does best in caves. It had transformed dry rope into mud-coated cable. His ascender refused to release. He pulled, twisted, worked at the mechanism while hanging in space, water pouring around him. The bottom 30 feet of the pit channeled a small waterfall even in dry conditions. The hard rain had magnified it into a deluge. Masterman hung directly in the flow, getting colder with each passing second. Leonhardt made a decision. A second rope, left rigged by spelunkers conducting a survey. offered a parallel route upward. He could ascend that rope, reach Masterman, provide the second pair of hands that would solve the mechanical problem. He clipped in and began climbing. Then Masterman dropped something. The equipment fell perhaps 20 feet, accelerating under gravity's patient pull, and struck Leonhardt's helmet with enough force to kill his light. In cave rescue literature, light failure represents one of the fundamental emergencies. Without light, caves become not just dark, but absolutely, completely, primordially dark. The kind of darkness that makes darkness above ground seem like twilight by comparison. Leonhardt switched to his alternate bulb. The dual bulb system, redundancy built into design, saved him. But among the dropped items were Masterman's foot slings, those seemingly simple pieces of webbing that allow an explorer to stand upward in their ascenders, transferring body weight through legs rather than arms. Without them, ascending becomes exponentially more difficult. With them, it's a systematic process. Without them, as Leonhardt understood immediately, the situation had transformed from very bad to truly frightening. Leonhardt shouted down to Schmidt, trying to coordinate throwing the foot slings back up, or tying them to the rope for hauling. But the waterfall had become a wall of white noise, drowning human voices in its constant roar. The cave, neutral as always, simply amplified the water's presence and swallowed their attempts at coordination. Leonhardt reached Masterman's position and tried to support his weight manually, attempting to create enough slack for the jammed ascender to release. The physics worked against them. One man hanging from a rope cannot easily create slack for himself, and a second man on a different rope cannot easily provide the necessary lift. They struggled in the waterfall's spray, both getting colder, both aware that time was becoming an enemy. "I'm losing it," Masterman finally said. The words carried weight beyond their simple meaning. In cave rescue terminology, losing it signals the approach of a critical threshold, the point where cold and exhaustion combine to impair judgment and physical capability. "I can't hang on much longer." Desperation produced a terrible request. "Give me a knife to cut myself loose." Neither Leonhardt nor Schmidt carried one. That absence, knife as basic cave tool, might have prevented a worse tragedy. But it also meant they had to solve the mechanical problem mechanically. They kept working, hands numb with cold, minds fighting the fog that hypothermia brings. They manipulated metal and rope and webbing. Eventually, finally, the jammed ascender released, and Masterman fell like a rock. 15 feet of free fall, his descender untied, unweighted, providing no friction, no braking, no gradual deceleration. Just gravity's acceleration until the cave floor intervened, stopping his body's downward trajectory by breaking his left tibia and fibula, both bones in his lower leg shattered by the impact. The sound must have been sickening. Impact, breaking, the immediate cry of pain that signals serious injury. The kind of sound that transforms an accident into a rescue operation. Protocol demanded that Leonhardt continue ascending, exit the cave, summon help. But Leonhardt, after hanging in the waterfall with Masterman, recognized his own deteriorating condition. He felt himself starting to lose it, worried about his compromised light, understood that vertical work while hypothermic invited another casualty. He made the harder choice: rappel down, stay with the injured, send Schmidt out for help. At the bottom, he performed the immediate necessities, helped Masterman remove wet clothing, provided dry polypropylene layers, splinted the broken leg with sticks and webbing, the improvised first aid that keeps injured ones stable until proper rescue arrives. Schmidt began her own ascent and immediately encountered difficulties. Her ascender jammed, mud on rope creating friction and malfunction. A redirection point that the survey party had rigged complicated her route. She made the decision to switch to the second rope, calling for Leonhardt to pull it within reach, and successfully completed her climb to the surface. At that moment, the survey party returned to the cave. They provided additional warm clothing, a balaclava, a space blanket, the small comforts that combat hypothermia's advance. 3 of them headed back out to gather more supplies and communication equipment. Schmidt reached the surface, found a nearby house, called for help. The local rescue squad mobilized, joining with assembled spelunkers to extract Masterman from the pit. The rescue proved complicated, weather still deteriorating, rigging challenges, communication problems amplified by the waterfall's noise. It took several hours of coordinated effort, multiple personnel, specialized equipment, and careful hauling to bring Masterman back to the surface. He emerged at approximately 2:30 a.m., 6.5 hours after the rain began at 8 p.m., 6.5 hours that transformed a routine through trip into a major rescue operation. An ambulance transported him to the hospital in Elkins, where doctors would repair bones that proper procedure might have kept intact. On November 25, 1977, a group of 12 experienced underground explorers from the Windy City Grotto made the drive to Georgia to do exactly that. They had the skills. They had the equipment. They had done difficult drops before, and when they arrived at Ellison's cave that morning and found it experiencing high water, more water moving through the system than usual, waterfalls where there were sometimes only damp walls, they made their assessment and decided to proceed. This was the first decision. It would not be the last. One entrance was blocked entirely by a waterfall. Another nearby entrance allowed entry without getting completely soaked, a stream running in alongside them as they ducked underground. They entered at 1:30 in the afternoon, 12 people moving through the dark in single file. At 1:30, that felt like plenty of time. It wouldn't feel that way for long. The first significant drop in the system, spelunkers call it the warm-up pit, 130 feet down, a warm-up run before the main event, is where they encountered the first complication. 2 explorers from a Pittsburgh grotto were already in the cave, ahead of them on the same route, working toward the same destination. A waterfall at the warm-up was positioned away from the rappel rope, which was fortunate, but the spray at the bottom reached everything and everyone. By the time the combined group stood at the edge of Fantastic Pit, there were 19 people looking down into that enormous dark. 17 of them planning to go all the way to the bottom. They talked it over. The Pittsburgh group would go first. And this is the moment I want you to pay attention to, because this is where the invisible clock started running. 19 people, 2 groups, 1 rope, a cave full of moving water. What felt like an organizational decision, a reasonable way to manage a large group in a tight space, was actually the beginning of a sequence of events that nobody had a clear view of yet. The descent into Fantastic Pit began. About 200 feet down, everything slowed. A waterfall was spraying the rope with heavy mist, coating it in a continuous film of water. A wet rope running through a descending device behaves differently than a dry one. The friction changes, the control becomes more demanding, the whole process more physically taxing and dramatically slower. The explorers descending made the right call and took their time. Caution was appropriate, but caution meant time, and time was the one resource that was quietly running out. At the bottom of the pit, in the large chamber called Tag Hall, the situation was already becoming grim. The waterfall sent spray into the chamber itself, and the water-generated wind moved that spray in every direction. The entire group was pressed into the back of that space trying to stay warm. Some of them pulled plastic bags from their packs and improvised makeshift shelters, using candles as heat sources inside, small flickering flames against the cold of a cave that maintains a steady temperature in the low 50s, regardless of the season. A temperature that feels fine when you're moving, but predatory when you're wet and still and the hours are piling up. One person was already suffering cramps from the physical exertion of the descent. The Pittsburgh group eventually headed off to explore the lower sections of the cave. The Windy City group huddled and waited, trying to stay warm, trying to stay patient, the cold working on them in the dark. Outside, without anyone underground knowing it, the temperature was falling, the day was ending, and the night that was settling over Pigeon Mountain was not a forgiving one. Jim Quaid was one of the first to begin heading out, moving upward through the system with one other person, while the Pittsburgh explorers waited at the top of Fantastic Pit, and the rest of the Windy City group prepared to follow. Staggering the ascent was smart. It would prevent a dangerous bottleneck at the upper drops. Quaid moved up through the cave, wet and tired, working his ascenders, and eventually pulled himself out into the open air. What he found outside stopped him cold. The temperature had dropped to 23 degrees Fahrenheit. One of the Pittsburgh explorers who had already made it out was stumbling down the mountain trail, confused, incoherent, not making sense when he tried to speak. This was not someone being dramatic. This was a person whose core body temperature had dropped enough that his brain was no longer working correctly. Quaid guided him to the vehicles and got him into warmth. Then he stood in the freezing dark and did the math. 18 people still underground, wet, cold, a system full of moving water and long vertical drops. A temperature outside that would kill an unprepared person. A descent into the cave that had already taken hours longer than it should have. And an ascent, 500 feet of rope climbing through a waterfall-soaked pit, still ahead of every single one of them. Quaid went to the nearest houses. He knocked on doors. He found a man named Smokey Caldwell. Caldwell dropped everything. He rounded up more experienced explorers from the area. He organized a response. Within a short time, a fire was burning at the entrance to Ellison's cave, and a group of people who had nothing to gain from this were settling in for what would become a 10-hour vigil in 23-degree temperatures, waiting for people they had never met to come out of the dark. Caldwell himself went into the cave to assess conditions and position himself where he could help the most. Inside, the reality of the situation was becoming impossible to ignore. The Pittsburgh group was ascending first because they were in worse shape. The cold had hit them harder, possibly because of their earlier exertion exploring the lower sections. Two people ascending in tandem because solo climbing was becoming too difficult for some of them was taking approximately 2 hours per pair. 2 hours per pair. Do that math for a moment and sit with what it means. Multiple pairs still to go. A cave getting no warmer. People waiting below getting progressively colder as the hours passed. And above all of them, that 23-degree night pressing down on the mountain like a lid. This is when the situation crossed from difficult into genuinely dangerous. Not because of any single dramatic event, no rockfall, no flood, no sudden emergency. Just the slow arithmetic of time and cold and the human body's finite reserves. People who had entered the cave that afternoon, as experienced, capable, well-equipped explorers, were now struggling to do things their bodies knew how to do automatically. The cold was getting inside the machinery. Hypothermia is insidious precisely because it mimics the symptoms of the very conditions you're already in. You're tired, but you were already tired from the rappel. You're confused, but caves are disorienting. You're struggling with your equipment, but the equipment is wet and cold, and your hands are stiff. At the nuisance drop, one of the Pittsburgh members reached a complete stop. He could not go on, not without something changing. Someone brought warm food and dry clothing down from the surface cache that Caldwell's group had staged near the entrance. That person recovered enough to continue and made out. Just then, another situation came up at the warm-up pit. One more member became extremely hypothermic mid-ascend. It was 130 feet of rope, the last major obstacle before the exit. Caldwell made a decision that says everything about who he was and what he understood about the situation. He attached himself to the rope. The hypothermic patient was clipped below him, the two connected by a sling, and Caldwell climbed. He hauled a human being up the rope with him. physically carrying someone who no longer had enough left in their body to make the climb alone, because leaving 72 square mile them was not a thing he was willing to do. The last Pittsburgh explorer to ascend Fantastic Pit couldn't rig his own ascenders. These are mechanical devices he had attached to ropes dozens of times before. The knowledge was in his hands and his muscle memory, and his body temperature had dropped far enough that he could not make his hands perform a task he had done automatically for years. Someone had to set up his own gear for him before he could begin the climb that would save his life. He made it out. 30 hours after the first person entered Ellison's cave, the last person came out into the cold Georgia night. The fire Caldwell's group had built was still burning. It had been burning for 10 hours. The analysis that followed was direct about what had gone wrong. The cave was carrying too much water for a group this size. The presence of two groups operating in the same system simultaneously, 19 people working through the same sequence of drops, created the kind of delays that turn a difficult trip into a survival situation. Stronger leadership might have made the call to leave the cave alone that day. Better judgment might have looked at the high water and the dropping temperature and chosen a different objective. The cave didn't know about their experience. The cold didn't make exceptions for their credentials and were about to give in to it. But a man named Smokey Caldwell built a fire and kept it burning for 10 hours. And that fire and the people around it and Jim Quaid knocking on a stranger's door because he understood what was happening underground and couldn't do nothing about it. That is the reason 19 people made it home. That is the only reason. Nam Talu Cave, Khao Sok National Park, Thailand, August 2007. The rainforest of Khao Sok had been breathing for 160 million years. Older than the Amazon, older than most things humans have ever tried to name, it stretched across the southern Thai highlands in an unbroken cathedral of green. It was, by any measure, one of the most beautiful places on Earth. And like most places of extraordinary beauty, it held within it the quiet, patient capacity for catastrophe. Helena Carroll knew none of this when she arrived. She was 20-something, traveling through Southeast Asia with her boyfriend John Cullen. The kind of trip young people take when they are happy and in love and feel, in that particular way that happiness and love tend to produce, entirely untouchable. John was the sort of man who moved through the world with an easy, unforced confidence. Not arrogance, nothing like that. Just a steadiness. A reliability that Helena had come to lean on, the way you lean on something you've tested enough times to trust completely. He said what he meant. He did what he said. In 2 years, he had not once been otherwise. They had arrived in Khao Sok with every intention of seeing the caves. Nam Talu Cave was one of the region's most celebrated natural attractions. A subterranean river system carved over millennia through the limestone heart of the park, winding deep underground through chambers of extraordinary formation. Stalactites hanging like frozen chandeliers above water, so clear you could see the bottom. Tourists came from across the world to float through it on rubber tubes, headlamps cutting pale light through the dark, voices bouncing off walls that had never seen sunlight. It was the kind of experience people described afterward with the slightly dazed look of someone who has seen something they weren't sure language was built to carry. But it was August, and August, in Khao Sok, meant monsoon. The man at the guest house had told them, quietly, carefully, in the way that people who understand a place try to communicate with people who don't. He had pressed his palms together and shaken his head and said the rains were heavy. The river in the cave was unpredictable. It was not the season to go inside. Helena had felt something move through her when he said it, a small, cold instinct, the kind the body produces when it knows something the mind hasn't caught up to yet. She had looked at John. John had smiled and said they'd be fine. And because he had always been right before, and because the brochure was beautiful, and because they had come so far, they went. There were 8 of them in total that morning. Helena and John, 2 German couples, an Australian backpacker, and a retired school teacher from England who had spent 40 years teaching geography. and, as she mentioned cheerfully while strapping on her helmet, had always wanted to see the inside of a karst cave system. They waded into the entrance together, tubes in hand, headlamps on, the sound of the jungle falling away behind them as the limestone closed overhead and the world became dark and cool and impossibly still. For the first hour, the cave gave them everything it had promised. The formations were extraordinary. Columns of calcium carbonate built across thousands of years, stalactites descending toward their own reflections in the water below. The silence broken only by the soft drip of mineral-rich water and the low murmur of the group moving through the dark. Helena floated on her back for a stretch and stared up at a ceiling she couldn't fully see and felt, for a moment, the particular smallness that beautiful and ancient things tend to produce in people. Not unpleasant, just humbling. She reached out and found John's hand in the water. He squeezed it without looking over. He always did that. It was the sound that came first. Not dramatic, not immediately alarming, just a low, persistent roar beneath everything else, like the cave had begun to breathe differently. Helena noticed it and said nothing, assuming it was acoustics, the echo of their own movement amplified by the limestone. Then the water shifted. It had been calm and cool and knee-deep. Suddenly it was pushing, not violently, but with a new intention, a directional force that hadn't been there before. She looked at John. He was already looking at the walls. Then someone behind them screamed, and the cave became a different place entirely. The flood came, the way flash floods always come inside enclosed spaces, total and immediate and without negotiation. The water rose from knee height to waist height in seconds, dark and freezing and moving with a power that made it immediately clear that human strength was not a relevant variable. The German couple nearest the entrance were swept off their feet before anyone could reach them. The Australian backpacker grabbed for a rock formation and missed. The sounds in the cave in those first 30 seconds were sounds Helena would carry for the rest of her life. Not the roaring water, which was almost abstract, but the human sounds. The sounds of people understanding what was happening to them. John had her arm before she had fully processed any of it. He was pulling her toward the cave wall, toward a shelf of rock ledge she wouldn't have found on her own. His headlamp sweeping the dark as he moved, deliberate and fast. He boosted her up first. She grabbed the limestone and climbed, fingers finding holds by instinct. And she made it onto the ledge and turned back, and the water was already at John's chest. He made it up. They sat pressed together on the narrow shelf, maybe 18 inches of wet rock between them and the flood churning below. And John was quiet in the way he got quiet when he was thinking through something serious. His light swept the cave around them. Helena watched his face. She had learned to read it in 2 years. Then he looked at her. "I can swim for it," he said. "Get to the entrance. Get help." She wanted to say no. Every part of her wanted to say no. She wanted to grab him and hold on and refuse, because the water below them was black and moving fast, and she could not see where it went. But she looked at his face and saw what she always saw there. Not recklessness, not performance. Just the same steady, quiet certainty that had characterized every promise he had ever made her. He had never said he could do something he couldn't do. He had never offered something he didn't deliver. He was, in the most fundamental way, a man who kept his word. He held her face in both hands. His palms were cold. "Stay high, don't move," he said. "I'll bring people back, I promise." And then he was in the water, and then he was gone, and then there was only the dark and the roaring, and Helena alone on a ledge in the belly of a limestone cave while the flood did what floods do. She prayed. She was not a woman who prayed often or with any particular conviction, but she prayed now with everything she had. Not elaborate prayers, not theological ones, just the raw, stripped-down kind that crisis produces. The kind that is less a conversation with God and more a conversation with the universe, with whatever might be present in the dark that could be bargained with. Please, Please. He promised. He always keeps his promises. Please let him make it. Please let this be over. Please. She thought about the promise over and over, turned it in her mind like something solid, something she could hold. In 2 years, he had never once broken his word to her. Not once. Small things and large things, trivial and significant. He showed up, he followed through. He did what he said he would do. That was John. That was simply who he was. And so, she held it against the cold and the dark and the sound of the water and the 8 hours that passed on that ledge in a way that time does not normally pass, stretching and compressing and dissolving until it meant nothing at all. She prayed and she waited and she held on to the promise. The rescuers' lights came before their voices did. White beams cutting through the dark from the direction of the entrance, sweeping the cave walls. Helena heard Thai voices, urgent and searching, and she used what was left of hers to call back, and they found her. They helped her down from the ledge into water that had begun to recede, guided her toward the entrance, toward light. She wept when the gray morning sky opened above her, not from fear that had long since exhausted itself, but from relief so physical it felt like something leaving her body. He had done it. He had brought them. He had kept his promise. She was already composing what she would say to him when a rescue official crouched down in front of her, his face arranged in that particular careful way, and told her. She was the only survivor. All 7 others were gone. John had been found downstream. The rescue had come not because he had reached help, but because the tour group's failure to return had triggered an alarm. The cave was still being searched. Body recovery operations were underway. Helena Carroll sat in the rain outside Nam Talu Cave while the jungle steamed around her and understood, in the slow and total way that unbearable things make themselves understood, that the world she had known 8 hours ago no longer existed, that the person who had pressed his forehead to hers in the dark and said, "I promise," was gone, that she had waited and prayed and held on to that promise for 8 hours in the belly of a cave, and the promise had kept her alive, and the person who made it had not survived to see it. He had kept it anyway. In some way she couldn't explain and would spend a long time trying to, he had kept it anyway. And she was alone, completely, permanently, devastatingly alone. Alive in a world that now had a John-shaped absence at the center of it, sitting in the rain on the edge of a rainforest that had been breathing for 160 million years, completely indifferent to any of it. Crystal 67 Cave, a cave that cuts deep into the western slope of the Sierras, a place of dark cathedral rooms and ancient stone. It was mid-August 1988 when a team of 11 decided to explore the depths of this cave. They gathered at the entrance, checked their gear, and somewhere around the afternoon, all 11 descended into Crystal 67 Cave. The cave wasn't much of a challenge at first. They slowly and carefully made their way down to the mountain room, a vast, echoing chamber at the bottom section of the cave, where the air sat cold and still and smelled of wet limestone. The group spread out naturally, as cave explorers do, drawn by curiosity in different directions. Some drifted toward the far walls to study the formations. 2 climbed down toward the pit at the far end of the room, and a cluster of 4 made their way toward the long rubble slope that rose steeply along one side of the mountain room, picking their way upward over the loose, tumbled rock. Nobody thought much of it. They'd done this kind of thing 100 times. Marcus made his way near the top of the slope, where suddenly, while shifting his weight, his boot struck firmly to a rock. The slope was a rubble of loose rocks staying on top of each other. As he struck a rock, it triggered a chain reaction, and the slope started rumbling. The rock skittered sideways, clipped another, and that one nudged another. For a while it seemed this might stop, and rocks would settle down, but they didn't. The small rocks found larger ones. The larger ones had been sitting in precarious balance for decades, maybe centuries, and now they were done waiting. The slope seemed to exhale. A low rumble built quickly into something much worse, a grinding cascade of stone that gathered speed and mass as it churned downward. The sound tore through the chamber. At the top of the slope, Marcus barely had time to register what he'd started before the ground beneath him shifted. A rock the size of a boot heel caught him square in the back of his construction-style helmet with a crack that echoed off the walls. The force drove him forward and down, his legs buckling, and he tumbled several feet down the slope before his shoulder caught a jutting ledge and stopped him. He lay there dazed, the world tilting, a hot throb spreading from his ankle where it had twisted hard beneath him on the way down. When he reached up and touched his helmet, he found the plastic shell had been breached, just slightly, a dent punched through. But his head beneath it ached with a deep, nauseating bruise. He tried to stand. His ankle folded. He stayed down. Just below Marcus on the slope, Derek had heard the shout and spun around, instinct pulling his eyes upward just in time to see the wave of rock coming. He threw himself sideways, but his boot found nothing solid, and he went down hard, one knee slamming into the rubble. The impact knocked him into Priya, who was scrambling to get out of the way just below him. She barely had time to register his weight before both of them went over together, sliding and tumbling down the lower section of the slope in a tangle of limbs and gear. Priya's elbow cracked against a flat stone. Derek's ribs took the edge of another. They came to rest in a heap at the base of the slope, both of them gasping, neither able to get up cleanly. Priya tried to push herself to her feet and found her right arm wouldn't take the weight. She sank back down. Derek got to one knee, groaned, and sat. The rocks kept coming. Joel had been angling across the middle of the slope when the cascade reached him. He had no time to do anything sensible. A stone caught his left leg and swept it out from under him, and he went down sideways into Sam, who was just below him, picking his way carefully over a loose section of rubble. Sam went over like a felled tree, headlamp shattering against a rock on the way down, plunging his immediate world into complete darkness. He hit the base of the slope hard, the breath driven entirely out of him, and lay still for a long moment in the black, unable to tell which way was up, ribs screaming. Joel slid to a stop just above him, face scraped, shoulder wrenched, one hand bleeding from where he'd grabbed at the rocks trying to stop himself. The rumbling died. Dust and grit hung in the lamplight like fog. For a moment, the mountain room was absolutely silent, except for the settling of the last few stones and the ragged sound of people trying to breathe. Down in the pit area at the far end of the room, Kate and Tom had frozen the moment they heard the shout. They pressed themselves against the wall and watched the cascade roar down the slope and fan out across the chamber floor. The rocks ground to a halt, perhaps 15 feet short of where they stood. Neither of them moved for several seconds after. Then Kate instructed them to go. They scrambled up out of the pit and crossed the room at a run. What they found when they got there was 5 people down across the slope, and its base in various states of injury and distress. Marcus was still near the top, unable to stand, calling out in a controlled voice that his ankle was gone and his head was ringing. Derek and Priya were tangled at the base of the slope. Priya cradling her arm, Derek bent over his ribs with his eyes shut. Joel was sitting up, hand wrapped in his bandana, shoulder held stiff and wrong, and Sam was still on his back in the dark, his lampless helmet cracked, talking in short sentences to let them know he was conscious. Kate told them not to move and stay as they are, with the kind of flat, steady authority that comes from knowing there is no other option. She then examined them individually. Tom was already pulling out the emergency kit. He crouched next to Sam first, got a spare light clipped to his helmet, then worked his way through each of them, checking for anything serious, keeping them still, keeping them talking. It became clear quickly that nobody was going to walk out of the mountain room on their own terms. Marcus couldn't put any weight on his ankle at all. Priya's arm needed to be stabilized before she moved anywhere. Sam's ribs and the force of the fall meant he needed help just getting upright. The others could move, barely, but not safely alone over the uneven terrain of the cave. Kate climbed back toward the entrance passage until she had a signal on the emergency radio. Barely, 1 bar, the connection cutting in and out, Anne made the call. She gave their location, the number of injured, the nature of the injuries. She was calm and specific. She said they were stable. She said they needed a rescue team with a litter for at least 2 of the 5. Then she went back down to the mountain room to wait with the rest of them. The team who could move helped the ones who couldn't get more comfortable, patting them against the cold stone with spare layers, keeping the lights going, keeping the conversation going. Because in a cave, in the dark, with injuries and shock setting in, silence is its own kind of danger. It took time. It always takes time. But the rescue team came. They were all escorted out using stretchers and then taken to the hospital. The one with the head injury later noted, with the particular dark humor of someone who has just survived their own mistake, that his construction-style helmet had probably saved him from something much worse. Even if the rock had punched clean through the plastic shell, the bruise on his skull lasted 2 weeks. He bought a proper caving helmet the following month. The group also agreed afterward that 11 people in a large open chamber needed someone calling the shots about who goes where, first up, first below, before the exploring started. It's the kind of lesson that feels obvious once you're sitting in a cave waiting for a rescue litter. At 6 p.m. on the evening of February 3rd, 1995, 3 young men walked into Grassy Cove Saltpeter Cave in Cumberland County, Tennessee, carrying almost nothing that could save their lives and no one on the outside who knew where they were going. Matt Gore was 19 years old. His 2 companions were about the same age. None of them had formal caving training. None of them wore helmets. Their lighting setup was minimal at best. And they had told no one, not a friend, not a family member, not a single person on the surface, that they were descending into one of the most unforgiving cave systems in the American Southeast. That one detail, that absence of a single phone call or a note left on a kitchen table, would come within hours of meaning that no one would ever find them in time. The cave itself is not a gentle place. Grassy Cove. Saltpeter Cave stretches deep into the Tennessee bedrock. A labyrinthine system of passages, drops, and chambers carved by water over millions of years. For experienced spelunkers with proper gear, it is a challenging but manageable environment. For 3 untrained teenagers with inadequate lights and no helmets, it was something else entirely. They moved through the cave for 6 hours, pressing deeper and deeper into the earth, navigating roughly 7,200 feet of underground passage before arriving at a chamber known as the Waterfall Room sometime around midnight. The air down there was cold and wet and still, the kind of cold that gets into your joints and stays. The sound of falling water echoed off the walls in every direction, making it difficult to tell where anything was or how far the darkness extended beyond the reach of their lights. And at the center of the room, dropping straight down into the black, was a 60-foot pit. They stood at the edge of it, looked down into nothing, and decided to climb in. What happened in the next few seconds would determine whether any of them made it out alive. Gore went first, pressing his boots against the rock wall and beginning his descent into the pit, his light cutting a narrow beam down into the shaft below him. The walls were irregular, studded with loose stone that had never needed to hold anyone's weight before. He reached for a handhold and his fingers caught the edge of a rock, and the rock moved. A cascade of dislodged stone broke free from the wall and came down directly onto him before he had any chance to react. And then he was falling, all 60 feet of the pit, opening up beneath him in an instant. The walls rushing past and the sound of his own fall swallowed by the noise of the waterfall. And then the bottom came up, and there was nothing after that. His skull was fractured, his face was fractured. Blood was pooling between his skull and his brain, a condition called an epidural hematoma, building pressure against the tissue inside with the slow, patient force of something that does not stop on its own. His neck and shoulder were badly injured. 2 of his fingers were dislocated. He was at the bottom of a 60-foot pit, 7,000 feet inside a cave in rural Tennessee at midnight. and the pressure inside his head was already climbing. His companions had ropes and equipment at the top of the pit. In their panic to reach him, they left everything up there and free climbed down with nothing. A decision that potentially could turn this story into 3 bodies instead of 1. They reached the bottom. They found Gore breathing. And then the first light went out. It happened without warning. One moment, a beam cutting through the dark. The next, nothing. They looked at each other. One light left between 3 people at the bottom of a 60-foot pit. Then that one began to fade, the glow shrinking from white to amber to a dim, dying orange. They tapped it, shook it, pressed the switch back and forth. It flickered once, held for a moment as if reconsidering, and then it was gone too. The waterfall room became something that has no real equivalent above ground. A total, featureless, wall-to-wall blackness in which the human eye finds absolutely nothing to work with, no matter how long it adjusts, no matter how wide it opens. The sound of the waterfall was still there, surrounding them from every direction, but they could not see Gore, could not see the walls, could not see their own hands held inches from their faces. They were at the bottom of a 60-foot pit, with a critically injured and possibly dying friend, completely blind, more than a mile inside the earth, and no one above ground had any idea they were there. The question was no longer whether the situation was bad. The question was whether any of them would still be alive by the time anyone thought to look. They stayed like that for 3 hours, 3 hours of total darkness at the bottom of that pit. One friend unconscious and bleeding from his skull, 2 others sitting in the black, trying to hold themselves together and figure out what came next. The cold worked into them steadily. The sound of the waterfall never stopped. At some point in those 3 hours, one of them reached into his pocket and felt the rectangular shape of a disposable Bic lighter, the kind that costs $1 at a gas station and runs out of fuel in minutes, and understood that this was what they had. He used it to climb. One hand on the rock, one hand holding the lighter. 60 feet of raw cave wall going straight up. The flame barely illuminating the surface a foot ahead of him, burning down toward his thumb with every second he held it. He climbed anyway. He made it to the top, gathered what he could find, fresh batteries, a blanket, a small stove, and lowered them down to the companion who had agreed to stay below with Gore in the dark. Then he turned and started moving, alone now, through 7,200 feet of cave passage with whatever fuel remained in that lighter, and whatever secondary light source he had managed to piece together, walking as fast as the terrain allowed, toward an entrance that was still more than a mile away. Gore was still at the bottom of the pit. The hematoma was still building. Every minute that passed in that cave was a minute the pressure inside his skull climbed higher. And the threshold between survivable and unsurvivable is not a wide one. It took 3 more hours to reach the surface. He came out of the cave at 7 a.m. on February 4th, 13 hours after they had entered, and immediately made the call that triggered everything. Local rescue teams, regional cave rescue specialists, emergency medical personnel, all of them now converging on the entrance to Grassy Cove Saltpeter Cave and beginning the long, technical, exhausting work of moving a critically injured patient through more than a mile of underground passage. An epidural hematoma does not plateau and wait for rescuers. The blood keeps accumulating, the pressure keeps rising, and somewhere past a certain point, the damage it causes stops being reversible. The rescue teams knew this. They moved fast. What they had to navigate was not forgiving. More than a mile of cave, with all the drops and squeezes and uneven terrain that had taken a healthy 19-year-old 6 hours to move through the night before. Now they were doing it in reverse, with a patient on a stretcher, managing a skull fracture and a neck injury, and an intracranial bleed that was racing the clock. It took them the better part of a day. At 7:42 p.m. on February 4th, nearly 26 hours after Matt Gore had walked into that cave on his own 2 feet, he was carried out of it and loaded onto a helicopter He was listed in stable condition at the hospital. He survived. The epidural hematoma was treated. The fractures were treated. The dislocated fingers were set. In the weeks that followed, Matt Gore recovered, and the story of what happened in Grassy Cove Saltpeter Cave on the night of February 3rd became one more entry in the long record of what happens when people enter serious cave systems without training, without proper equipment, and without telling anyone where they are going. It was May 10th, 2003, and Lance Taysom had no reason to believe that anything about that morning was going to go wrong. He had made this trip before. He knew Crystal Ice Cave the way you know a road you have driven 100 times. The turns, the drops, the rhythm of it. The way the dark opens up into rooms that feel almost too large to exist underground. The cave sits in the lava rock of southeastern Idaho, out in the high desert where the land is flat and wide, and the sky seems bigger than it has any right to be. And it had been drawing spelunkers for years because of its particular beauty and the elegance of its layout. You entered through a 42-foot, 13-meter, vertical drop at the main entrance, descended into a network of passages lined with ice formations that caught the lamplight and threw it back into cold, fractured pieces, worked your way through the cave's lower sections, and eventually arrived at a second drop, 50 feet, 15 meters down, that delivered you into a deep room with a 150-foot, 46-meter skylight shaft, punching straight up through the rock to the open sky above. That skylight was the exit. You climbed the fixed rope, you emerged into the daylight, and the cave let you go. Clean, simple, beautiful. A through trip in the truest sense of the word, the kind that feels like the cave itself has taken you somewhere and returned you changed. Lance had brought his 8-year-old son Jesse along, which tells you something about the kind of spelunker Lance was and the kind of childhood Jesse was having. Their companions that day were a climber friend of Lance's, 39 years old, and the climber's 13-year-old son. 4 people total, 2 fathers, 2 boys, standing in the Idaho desert on a cold, clear morning, getting their gear sorted and preparing to drop into the earth. Before they went in through the main entrance, Lance did what he always did. He walked over to the skylight opening on the surface, crouched down at the edge, and looked into the pit below. The skylight shaft was open and visible, daylight filtering straight down through 150 feet, 46 meters of rock, and at the bottom of the pit, he could see the floor clearly. Snow-covered, as it almost always was at that time of year, with several coils of his 200-foot, 61-meter rope lying slack on the surface. He had rigged the rope earlier, lowering it down the shaft, and those coils were confirmation that the rope had reached the bottom and was ready and waiting for them. Everything looked exactly right. Everything looked exactly as it always did. Lance had no reason to think otherwise, so he didn't. And he and the others walked to the main entrance and dropped in. The afternoon went the way good caving afternoons go, slowly, carefully, with headlamps sweeping over formations and the particular silence of deep underground pressing in around them. They moved through the passages and the rooms, took the first drop without issue, worked their way deeper into the cave's lower sections, and eventually arrived at the second drop. Lance rigged it as a pull-down, meaning once they descended, they would pull the rope down after them. This is a normal practice on through trips. It is also a point of no return, and experienced cave explorers understand this clearly. When that rope comes down, the way back closes. The only direction left is forward, toward the skylight, toward the exit, toward the surface. Lance knew this. He made the decision with full awareness of what it meant, because he had made this trip before, and he knew what was waiting for them on the other side of that second drop. He knew the skylight room, the fixed rope, the climb upward into the light. He had no reason to believe that any of it had changed. The rope came down, and they moved on. This is the part of the story where you have to understand something about the way experienced people get into serious trouble. It is almost never because they did something foolish or careless or reckless. It is almost always because they did something reasonable based on what they knew, and what they knew turned out to be missing a single critical piece of information. One fact, sitting quietly somewhere out of sight, that would have changed everything if they had known it. Lance Taysom was walking straight into a situation that was going to test him in ways he had not anticipated. because the cave had changed in the months since he had last been inside it, and it had changed in a way that nobody who hadn't been inside it recently would have had any reason to know. As they moved through the passage toward the skylight room, Lance noticed something wrong before he could name it. He had been in this cave enough times to carry a mental map of how it felt at every stage, and one of the things he knew about the approach to the skylight was the light, the faint, diluted suggestion of daylight that began to bleed into the dark as you got close. The way the quality of the black ahead of you shifted just slightly when you were near a natural shaft open to the sky. That shift wasn't there. The passage ahead was as dark as the passage behind, with the flat, muffled quality of a space that had been sealed, and Lance felt his stomach drop before his brain had fully caught up to what his instincts were already telling him. When they reached the skylight room, what they found was a wall of snow, not a dusting, not a manageable accumulation, 15 to 20 feet, 4.5 to 6 meters, of hard-packed snow filling the passage from floor to ceiling, blocking the exit completely. A white and absolute dead end where the climb upward was supposed to be. The cave had been corked. Lance stood with his headlamp on that wall of snow and understood several things in rapid succession. The second drop rope was gone, pulled down, and left behind them. The passage back was closed, there was no other exit, and his 8-year-old son was standing next to him in the cold. Here is what had happened. The previous summer, a wildfire had swept across the high desert surrounding Crystal Ice Cave and burned away the sagebrush that had covered the area for years. That sagebrush, which most people would never have thought to connect to the cave below, had been acting as a windbreak, and without it, the prevailing east wind had nothing to stop it from driving enormous quantities of snow straight down into the skylight shaft all winter long. The snow had accumulated in the pit at the base of the shaft, rising week by week through the cold months until it had buried the connecting passage completely, filling the room to a depth 20 feet, 6 meters, higher than normal. When Lance had looked down from the surface that morning and seen rope coils on the snow floor, he had been looking at a false floor, a buried surface 20 feet, 6 meters, above where the actual floor was supposed to be. The rope had reached the snow, yes. It had not reached the bottom of the cave. He had verified exactly the wrong thing, and the cave had given him no indication that anything was unusual because from the surface it looked entirely normal. What Lance did next is the part of this story that matters most because a lot of people in that situation, 2 ways out, both closed, 4 people including 2 children, no rescue pre-plan activated for hours yet, would have spent critical time in something close to panic. Lance did not do that. He looked at what he had, a sharp rock, an ice screw, 2 fathers, 2 boys. He began to cut steps up the face of the snow plume with the rock and the screw, working his way methodically up to the ceiling to confirm with his own hands that the passage was blocked, which it was. And then he came back down and walked the entire perimeter of the snow-filled room, looking for anything that wasn't a dead end. In one corner, where the snow met the passage wall, he found it, a gap 4 to 6 inches, 10 to 15 centimeters, wide, where the snow had pulled away from the rock through settling or sublimation. A narrow seam that ran upward in the direction of the skylight and disappeared into the dark, 4 to 6 inches, 10 to 15 centimeters. It was almost nothing, but almost nothing is not nothing. And Lance Taysom had 2 things in his favor at that moment, an ice screw and an 8-year-old boy who had been raised in caves. He placed the ice screw, rigged a belay for Jesse, and the 2 of them worked at that gap together, scraping and prying and pulling snow away from the rock wall by hand until the opening was just barely wide enough for a small body to enter. Jesse went in without hesitation, pushing through 3 feet, less than a meter, of compressed dark before the passage widened to 18 inches, 45 centimeters, and he could move forward properly, crawling and squeezing through the snow-filled seam for another 20 feet, 6 meters, until he saw it, light, cold, and white, and absolutely real, filtering down through the packed snow above him from the Idaho sky. He dug upward with his hands and his body and whatever he had, pushing through the final layer of packed snow until it broke open above him and he was in the skylight pit, standing in daylight, breathing cold air, entirely alive. Then, because he was 8 years old and had been raised by the right person, he turned around and went back in to help get the others out. Working together from both ends, Jesse from above and Lance from below, they enlarged the passage section by section until it was wide enough for gear and then for people. And then Lance sent the climber's son through, and then his friend, and then he went through himself, last, pulling his equipment behind him in the dark and emerged into a cave pit flooded with light. They climbed the rope. They stepped out onto the surface. The desert was cold and flat, and exactly as they had left it, indifferent and vast, with no idea what had just happened underneath it. Lance later learned that 2 weeks before his trip, a group of college students had attempted the same through trip and discovered the blocked passage after pulling the rope from the first drop, but before pulling the second. Unable to go forward and trapped at the base of the first drop, they had spent almost an hour in the dark, blowing a rescue whistle until a student who had stayed on the surface finally heard them, came to the edge, and with shouted instructions managed to re-rig the drop and bring them out. That group had been lucky in a different way than Lance's group had been lucky. Everyone who had gone into that cave while it was sealed had made it back out. But the margins were different each time, and the margins were the whole story. Lance Taysom's advice afterward was simple and specific. Verify the passage between the second drop and the skylight floor is actually passable before you enter. Not from the surface, but at the passage itself, physically, with your own eyes and hands, because the surface can lie to you. And think hard before you pull any rope on a through trip, because the commitment it represents is total and caves do not negotiate. By now, you guys should know what's scary about caves. It's not the darkness. It's not even the tight squeezes. It's the moment when a cave looks easy, big walking passages, 2 levels, nothing technical, no ropes, no pits, just a chill day underground. And then, at the very end, the cave quietly asks you a question. Can you swim through me? That's what happened in Mexico, near Bustamante, on November 26, 1971. 2 teenage explorer scouts, Chris Cleveland, 18, and Bruce Stone, 17, went into a cave with a group, but not all came out. The trip starts like a normal adventure. The group left Houston on Wednesday, November 23rd, heading to the Bustamante area for caving. They arrived Thursday morning, set up camp, got ready for 2 days of caves. Nothing in the mood suggests fear. It's a holiday weekend vibe, a trip. On Friday morning, the 26th, they go to Carazal. The leader, John Everidge, who was around 21, describes the cave as simple, large walking passage, 2 levels, spring-fed siphon at the end of the lower level. In caving, a siphon is basically an underwater section that blocks the passage. So imagine you're walking through a cave tunnel, and the tunnel doesn't end in rock, it ends in water, and the ceiling continues under the water, meaning the passage keeps going, but you can't breathe. So if you want to reach the dry cave on the other side, you have to. Hold your breath, go underwater, and follow the passage until you pop out into the air again. People sometimes call it a sumps situation, but in this case, they call it a siphon. And here's the trap. A siphon can look like a simple underwater swim, like a short little pool crossing. But it's often not a straight tube. It can dip, it can widen, it can hide deeper drop-offs, it can have confusing side pockets. And when the water rises even a little, the short swim can become a much longer one. It was a breath-hold dive in a cave, where the wrong direction put you into a deeper zone. Now, imagine being young, excited, surrounded by people, and seeing someone else do it. That's where this story turns. The group is about 20 people and splits into parties. One group goes in first, the other follows around 10 minutes later. Everything is normal until they reach the end of the lower passage, because there it is. A pool, a low rocky ceiling, the tunnel continuing underwater. And on the far side, a dry continuation. It's the classic cave temptation. There's more cave over there, and you can see it. This is where the chain reaction begins. Everidge decides he's going to push the siphon. The siphon was roughly a 25-foot underwater swim. But here's the key. Conditions matter. At low water stages, it could be only 10 to 15 feet. But if the water is just a little higher, the length increases a lot. And the shape isn't a simple straight tube you blindly follow. It has a right way and a wrong way. The right side is the route to the air-filled continuation. The left side drops deeper, and there are small air pockets in the ceiling that can mess with your sense of direction and hope, like false promises. Verge undresses, takes a light, goes under, and makes it through. He comes out on the far side, explores a bit, and swims back. This part matters because, whether he intended it or not, he just demonstrated something to the group. It's doable. He answers questions. He tells everyone how far it is and how to follow the roof of the tunnel. And while he's doing that, he starts putting his clothes back on. His back is turned. And that's when Chris Cleveland makes his move. 1:15 p.m. Chris goes in without telling anyone. Chris said nothing. He just went in before people even fully realized what was happening. That detail is brutal because in a cave, especially around water, time is everything. If someone goes into a siphon and you don't track the moment they went under, you lose your baseline for when it becomes an emergency. But at 1:15 p.m., it still doesn't feel like an emergency. People probably assume he'll pop out in a few seconds. Then the second boy, Bruce Stone, decides he wants to try too. This is where you can almost feel how casual it still is. Verge explains again how to do it, and this time they attach a rope to Bruce. That sounds smart on paper, right? But the later events absolutely slammed how it was done. The rope was entrusted to a completely inexperienced belayer. The signals were backward, and they didn't discuss a time limit. A rope in a siphon is not magic. If you're not trained, it can become false confidence. Still, Bruce goes in, and about 2 minutes later, the rope jerks a couple times. Then it comes back, untied. To the people waiting, that looks like a success signal. Like, he made it, untied it, sent it back. So now, mentally they're thinking, Chris is through, Bruce is through, no problem. So they sit down, and they wait. Waiting is where the fear creeps in. Time in a cave hits different. On the surface, waiting 2 hours is annoying. Underground, waiting 2 hours is the moment your brain starts doing the math you don't want to do. Verge says after about 2 hours, he becomes worried that something might be wrong, so he goes through the siphon again to check. He swims to the other side, calls out for the two boys. No answer. He starts a search but finds nothing. He gives up and then swims back. At that point, the mood changes from they're exploring to they're missing. So he sends most of the troop out to find the rest of the party and get help. That's around 6:15 p.m., according to the report, which means it's now nighttime. 2 teens are missing in a cave, and the only way to reach them is through an underwater section. Here's the thing. If you're in a normal cave and someone is lost or hurt, you can search passages. But if the missing people are beyond a siphon, a flooded tunnel, then you don't just need help. You need cave divers. And cave divers aren't easy to find. Especially not in 1971, especially not on a major holiday weekend, and especially not in a different country. The group tried to contact officials, including the American consulate emergency lines, and getting nowhere. Then they try calling the US for assistance. They reportedly call people connected to the United States Air Force, Army, Navy, and even the State Department in Washington. And it goes nowhere. They finally reach spelunkers in the St. Louis area who know cave divers, and those divers agree to come. Meanwhile, they locate divers in Laredo. So, help is moving, but it's slow, complicated, and the cave is in Mexico, which adds layers of communication and logistics. And here's the ugly reality. Even if a cave diver arrives quickly, water conditions can shut everything down. Because when a siphon is disturbed, especially if it has silt, the visibility can go to 0. And 0 visibility cave diving is a nightmare even for experts. The divers arrived Saturday night. They went into the siphon, but the water was too muddy, so they stop until morning. That one line is terrifying, because imagine knowing the boys might be on the other side, and the rescue is right there, and the cave says, not yet, so they wait. And then Sunday morning, they go again. This time, what they found was nerve-wracking. The divers find both bodies still in the siphon, off to one side. And the analysis gives more detail that makes this even worse. To reach the air-filled room beyond, you had to stay to the right. But the bodies were found to the left, in the deeper zone, around 40 to 50 feet from the entrance to the siphon. One body was floating against the ceiling, the other was nearby. That detail tells a story without even trying. They didn't just calmly swim through a short underwater tube. Something went wrong in the siphon. They drifted or turned the wrong way. And once you're in a submerged cave tunnel, disoriented, holding your breath, panic is not just fear, panic is physics. Panic makes you kick harder, burn oxygen faster, lose direction faster, and blow your only chance. The divers believe the boys panicked and drowned. Then the bodies are brought to the surface. And here's another surreal part. The divers refused to help remove the bodies from the cave, so the job was done by Verge scouts and members of another caving group. The whole thing ends with exhausted people carrying out the dead in a foreign country on a holiday weekend, after fighting communication breakdowns for 2 days. The analysis lists 5 direct contributing errors, and it's blunt. Number 1, big group, weak supervision. Verge was responsible for 14 people, and the group was described as large, inadequately supervised, ill-equipped, inexperienced, and too casual about traveling and caving in Mexico. Number 2, the example problem. Verge went through the siphon without safety precautions, and that sets a tone whether you mean to or not. If the leader does it casually, the group reads it as safe. Number 3, Chris went without anyone knowing. Chris, a novice, entered while the leader was dressing with his back turned. Number 4, Bruce was allowed to go, despite being a total beginner, and the rope system was flawed. Inexperienced belay, backward signals, no time limit, and number 5, nobody explained the siphon's true shape and hazard. As far as they could determine, the boys were not instructed on the physical nature of the siphon, and they didn't ask either. And honestly, that last point is the quiet killer. On Monday morning, August 8, 1977, 2 13-year-old boys stood at the entrance to a cave near Lake Purdy, Alabama, and made a decision that would transform a casual exploration into a nightmare. Scott Mitchell and Ken Grund carried only 2 flashlights between them. No backup batteries, no map, no compass, no one waiting above who knew where they'd gone. They had time, curiosity, and the invincible confidence of early adolescence. What they didn't have was understanding of how quickly a cave could transform from playground to labyrinth. The entrance welcomed them with the cool exhalation that all caves breathe, air flowing from the Earth's constant temperature, meeting August's Alabama heat. They moved from sunlight into shadow, into darkness, their flashlight beams carving tunnels through the black, their voices echoing off limestone walls that had stood silent for millennia before human footsteps disturbed their peace. At approximately 10 a.m., they penetrated deep enough into the main passage to encounter the cave's permanent residents. Bats, dozens of them, hanging in clusters from the ceiling, their small bodies wrapped in leathery wings, their faces bearing that peculiar expression that evolution has carved into their features. Large ears for echolocation, small eyes that see better than humans assume, noses shaped for purposes that have nothing to do with human aesthetics. The bats were likely Myotis species, little brown bats or possibly gray bats, both common to Alabama caves, both protected species, though the boys wouldn't have known that. Both remarkably harmless, despite their appearance and the centuries of superstition that surround their kind. They hung in torpor, that energy-conserving state between sleep and wakefulness that allows them to survive on the minimal calories that insect hunting provides, until the boys' lights and voices disturbed them. The response was immediate and dramatic. Bats dropped from their roosting positions and took flight, their wings beating with that distinctive leathery sound that seems simultaneously too loud and too quiet for creatures so small. They filled the passage with erratic movement, swooping, diving, banking through three-dimensional space with the aerial acrobatics that evolution has perfected over millions of years. To Scott and Ken, it looked like an attack. This is where knowledge would have saved them. Bats are fundamentally shy creatures, evolved to hunt insects in darkness, to navigate by sound, to avoid large animals that might crush or eat them. They don't attack humans. They don't swoop at faces with intent to harm. They don't dive bomb as weapons. What they do when disturbed by lights and voices in their roosting cave is panic. They're trying to escape. They're searching for exits, the familiar routes to outside air where they can resume hunting, where they can flee from the incomprehensible disturbance that humans represent. Their flight patterns seem erratic because they're using echolocation to navigate around sudden obstacles. In this case, two 13-year-old boys standing in their escape route. The bats' ultrasonic calls, too high-pitched for human ears to detect, bounce off Scott and Ken's bodies, creating acoustic signatures that the bats interpret and avoid. Every swoop is a course correction. Every dive is an evasion. They're not attacking. They're executing emergency maneuvers around obstacles that shouldn't be there. But Scott and Ken didn't know this. They saw small, dark shapes diving toward their faces, felt the wind from passing wings, heard the chaos of dozens of animals in flight. They responded the way frightened adolescents respond to perceived threat. They fought back. The cave floor provided ammunition, soft mud, easily shaped into balls, throwable weapons against flying targets. They scooped and shaped and threw, launching projectiles at creatures whose only crime was trying to escape. The bats scattered further, their panic intensifying, their flight patterns growing more desperate. More swooping, more diving, more apparent aggression that was actually just more fear. Scott and Ken threw mudball after mudball, chasing the bats deeper into the cave system, following the fleeing animals through passages and junctions, their attention completely focused on the hunt, on the throwing, on the primal satisfaction of combat against what they perceived as attackers. They paid no attention to landmarks, no attention to the turns they were taking, no attention to the junctions they were passing through, no attention to the fundamental rule that every experienced caver learns before entering their first cave: always know the way out. Eventually, the bats dispersed completely, finding refuge in passages too small or too distant for the boys to follow. The excitement faded. The adrenaline ebbed. Scott and Ken stood in a passage they didn't recognize, breathing hard, covered in mud from their ammunition gathering, and slowly understood what they had done. They were lost. The cave near Lake Purdy is complex, not massive by caving standards, not requiring days to traverse, but sufficiently intricate that two inexperienced explorers without map or compass could easily become disoriented. Multiple passages branch from multiple junctions. Dead ends appear promising until you reach them. Routes that seem to lead toward the entrance instead curve back into the cave's depths. The boys tried to remember their route. They attempted to backtrack, following what they thought was their path of entry. But memory, especially memory formed during excited pursuit of perceived attackers, proves unreliable. The passage they chose didn't lead to sunlight. It led to another junction, another choice, another opportunity for error. They tried following water flow, a reasonable strategy since water eventually flows out of caves to reach streams and rivers. They wadded up pieces of paper or fabric, the report doesn't specify what they used as markers, and dropped them in the various rivulets and streams that trickled through passages. They followed each water route hopefully, walking hunched or crawling through passages that grew smaller, that descended when they wanted ascent, that ended at sumps or squeezes, or simply terminated in breakdown rooms where water seeped through cracks too small for human passage. One by one, the water routes failed to lead out. To their credit, Scott and Ken attempted systematic exploration. They didn't panic. They didn't run randomly through passages hoping for luck. They tried to apply logic to their predicament. They marked their unsuccessful attempts. Each dead-end passage received some kind of indicator. Perhaps stones arranged in patterns. Perhaps mud smeared on walls. Perhaps scratches in flowstone. The exact marking method isn't specified, but the intent was clear. Don't waste time exploring the same dead end twice. They tried alternative routes when water following failed. They attempted to sense air movement, to feel the subtle breeze that might indicate connection to the surface. They climbed when possible, descended when necessary, squeezed through restrictions hoping to find the passage beyond that would lead to exit. Each attempt led to a dead end. Each route terminated in stone. Each hope expired against the reality of the cave's complex geometry, and their lights were failing. One flashlight died completely. The beam that had seemed so bright at 10 a.m. simply faded to orange, then red, then nothing. The cave's darkness, absolute, complete, primordial darkness, pressed closer. The remaining flashlight grew progressively dimmer, its batteries depleting with each hour, its beam shrinking from flood to spot to weak suggestion of illumination. In strong light, a cave is merely dark. In failing light, a cave becomes genuinely frightening. Shadows deepen, obstacles appear suddenly. The visual cues that allow navigation disappear into blackness. And behind the failing light lurks the knowledge of what comes next. Total darkness, the kind of darkness that makes movement dangerous, that transforms simple walking into high-stakes navigation, that reduces experienced cavers to helpless statues waiting for rescue. By 6 p.m., 8 hours after entering the cave, 8 hours of unsuccessful searching, Scott and Ken had grown exhausted. They had been moving continuously, climbing and crawling and squeezing and backtracking, burning calories and depleting muscles. They needed rest. They needed to conserve what little battery life remained. They needed to make a decision about their next move. They found a spot that met their minimal requirements. Above the mud and water that covered much of the cave floor, flat enough for sitting or lying, dry enough to prevent the deep chill that comes from wet clothing in a cave's constant temperature. They picked this spot to sleep, to wait, to hope that somehow morning would bring solution, or that someone above ground would notice their absence and send help. And then they heard a voice. Somewhere in the cave, another group was exploring, a Sunday school outing, presumably older teenagers or adults with children, people doing exactly what Scott and Ken had done, entering a local cave for adventure and exploration. But this group had lights, knowledge, and most importantly, they knew the way out. Grunge shouted. His voice carried through passages and junctions, bouncing off walls, creating the complex echoes that make acoustic communication in caves so difficult. Sound travels through limestone and water and air in unpredictable ways, sometimes amplifying, sometimes canceling, always distorting. But through the echoes, contact was made. The Sunday school group followed the sound to its source. They found two exhausted, muddy, frightened 13-year-old boys who had been lost for 8 hours, whose lights had nearly failed, who had been preparing to spend the night underground with no guarantee of rescue. The group led them out, through the passages that had seemed so labyrinthine, following routes that became obvious when someone who knew the cave showed the way. The junctions that had offered paralyzing choices revealed their logic when properly understood. The dead ends that had consumed so much time were simply ignored in favor of routes that actually connected to the entrance. They emerged into Alabama evening, sunlight already fading toward dusk, but still bright compared to the cave's darkness. Scott and Ken, covered in mud, exhausted, chastened, stepped back into the surface world they had left 10 hours earlier. Yellowstone National Park sprawls across nearly 3,500 square miles of Wyoming, Montana, and Idaho, a landscape where the Earth's crust thins enough to allow magma's heat to rise close to the surface, creating geysers that shoot hundreds of feet skyward and hot springs that shimmer in colors ranging from deep blue to rust orange to sulfuric yellow. It is one of the most geologically violent places in North America. On July 20th, 1981, at approximately 1 p.m., this place would become the center point of one of the most painful tragedies imaginable. David Allen Kerwin was traveling through Yellowstone with his friend Ronald Ratliff and Ratliff's dog, Moosey. They were enjoying the summer weather, the spectacular scenery, the sense of adventure that draws millions to America's first national park each year. The afternoon was warm, typical for a July day in Wyoming, and the park's famous thermal features steamed and bubbled around them, drawing tourists on vacation to witness geological wonders found nowhere else on Earth. Moosey ran with the freedom that dogs experience in open spaces, making rounds and jumping around. Then Moosey saw the water. To a dog, water means play. Water means splashing and swimming, and the pure joy that canines express when immersed in their element. Moosey couldn't read the warning signs posted around Yellowstone's thermal features. He couldn't understand that some water in this park comes not from snowmelt or rainfall, but from deep underground, heated by magma, to temperatures that destroy organic tissue on contact. He saw shimmering blue water and did what dogs do. He broke away from Kerwin and Ratliff, ran toward the inviting pool, and jumped. The spring Moosey dove into was Celestine Pool, one of Yellowstone's countless thermal features. The water temperature in Celestine regularly reaches 200 degrees Fahrenheit, 93 degrees Celsius, hot enough to cook meat, hot enough to cause third-degree burns in seconds, hot enough that immersion means almost certain death. The beautiful blue color that attracted Moosey comes from the way light refracts through extremely hot, mineral-rich water. Moosey hit the water and immediately began yelping. The sound that emerged was primal pain, the kind of cry that bypasses reason and strikes directly at the emotional core of anyone who hears it. For dog owners, few sounds are more devastating than their pet in genuine distress. The yelping continued as Moosey thrashed in the water, unable to understand what was happening, unable to escape the thermal trap he'd jumped into. Kerwin and Ratliff rushed toward the spring. Other park visitors, understanding the danger that Kerwin and Ratliff perhaps didn't fully grasp, shouted warnings. The signs posted around thermal features exist for exactly this reason: to prevent people from approaching water that can kill in seconds. Hot springs in Yellowstone aren't like hot tubs or natural warm springs found elsewhere. They have water that can be acidic enough to dissolve bone. But Kerwin heard only Moosey's cries for help. What goes through a person's mind in the seconds before making a decision that will end their life? Did Kerwin calculate the risk and decide the dog's life was worth attempting to save? Regardless, Kerwin ignored everyone's urgent warnings. He didn't pause to assess the situation or test the water's temperature. He dove headfirst into Celestine Pool to save his friend's dog, launching himself into water hot enough to destroy human tissue on contact. The thermal shock struck him immediately, at 200 degrees Fahrenheit. Water doesn't need time to burn. It burns instantly, catastrophically. The human body's core temperature is approximately 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. The 100-degree difference between normal body temperature and Celestine Pool's water represents a thermal gradient that flesh and blood cannot withstand for more than seconds before sustaining irreversible damage. Kerwin swam toward Moosey, his body already being cooked by the surrounding heat. Every stroke through the water, every second of immersion meant more tissue destruction, more proteins denaturing, more cells dying. He reached the distressed dog and attempted to lift him out of the water. But even a medium-sized dog weighs enough that lifting one out of water while swimming requires significant strength and leverage. Difficult under the best circumstances, impossible when your hands are being burned. He couldn't lift Moosey. The dog, also being cooked alive in the superheated water, was thrashing in pain and panic. making the rescue attempt even more difficult. Kerwin disappeared beneath the surface. Whether intentionally diving deeper to get better leverage or simply losing his grip and sinking from exhaustion and thermal shock, the witnesses couldn't determine. He resurfaced moments later, still unable to rescue Moosey, and made the agonizing decision to abandon the rescue and save himself. He swam toward the edge of the pool, toward the witnesses, toward air and safety and the terrible reckoning of what he had done. When Ratliff and other witnesses pulled Kerwin from Celestine Pool, the extent of his injuries became immediately horrifyingly apparent. His feet had received second-degree burns, the kind of burns that destroy the outer layer of skin and penetrate deep into the dermis beneath, exposing nerve endings to air and creating pain that defies description. But his feet represented the least severe of his injuries. Witnesses heard him speak. Despite the trauma, despite the pain, despite what must have been overwhelming physical shock, Kerwin managed to form words. "That was stupid. How bad am I? That was a stupid thing I did." In those sentences lies terrible, dawning awareness. Kerwin understood, even in his critically injured state, that he had made a catastrophic mistake. Someone attempted to remove Kerwan's shoes, perhaps to assess the damage to his feet. What happened next added another layer of horror to an already nightmarish situation. Kerwin's skin came off with his shoes. The thermal damage had essentially cooked the tissue, separating epidermis from dermis, destroying the structural bonds that hold skin together, turning living flesh into something more resembling boiled meat than functioning tissue. Emergency responders transported Kerwin to Salt Lake City Hospital, the nearest medical facility equipped with the specialized burn unit and expertise necessary to handle victims with this severity of thermal injury. The transport itself must have been agonizing, every movement causing damaged tissue to shift, every vibration from the ambulance transmitting through burn nerve endings that still functioned enough to signal pain. Medical assessment revealed that Kerwin had received third-degree burns across the entirety of his body, including his head. Third-degree burns destroy all layers of skin, penetrating through epidermis and dermis into the subcutaneous fat and muscle beneath. They're called full-thickness burns because they go completely through the integumentary system, destroying everything from the surface down to underlying structures. Paradoxically, third-degree burns are often less painful than second-degree burns because they destroy nerve endings completely. The burned tissue simply can't transmit pain signals anymore. But Kerwin's injuries included both second-degree burns, which scream with pain, and third-degree burns, which eliminate pain through complete destruction. The combination meant some areas of his body sent overwhelming pain signals, while others sent nothing at all, creating a nightmarish sensory landscape. Kerwin had also been blinded by his immersion in Celestine Pool. The extreme heat had damaged his eyes beyond any possibility of function. He couldn't see the concerned faces around him, couldn't see the park he'd been enjoying moments before, couldn't see anything, and never would again. The medical staff who received Kerwin faced an almost impossible challenge. The statistics for such extensive burns are grim. Survival rates plummet as the percentage of body surface area burned increases, and total body burns approach a 0% survival rate even with the best modern medical intervention. Burn treatment requires multiple simultaneous interventions, removing dead tissue to prevent infection, maintaining fluid balance as the destroyed skin can no longer regulate water loss, managing pain that even powerful opioids can only partially address, preventing infection in tissue that has lost its primary protective barrier, and attempting to create conditions where healing might possibly begin. For burns covering such a large percentage of body surface area, each of these challenges becomes exponentially more difficult. The doctors did their best, but unfortunately Kerwin died the following morning, roughly 24 hours after diving into Celestine Pool. His death, while relatively quick considering the catastrophic severity of his injuries, was undoubtedly agonizing. Moosey also died. The dog that Kerwin dove in to save did not survive the thermal trauma of Celestine Pool. Whatever Kerwin's final thoughts were in that Salt Lake City hospital, he died knowing that his rescue attempt had failed completely. Both the would-be rescuer and the intended rescue had perished from their immersion in water hot enough to cook flesh in seconds. March 13th, 2011. It was a normal Tuesday. Mateo was 7 years old and out hiking with his parents at Enchanted Rock State Natural Area in Texas. One of those family days where the weather is decent, the trail isn't too hard, and nobody has anywhere to be. They'd made it to the top of the dome, worked their way down toward Echo Canyon, and by midday everything was fine. Just a regular family on a regular hike. Then Mateo found the cave. It wasn't hard to find. It sits right there in the canyon, and if you're a 7-year-old boy with any curiosity in you at all, a dark opening in the side of a rock face is basically a magnet. There was a sign that said, "No entry." He saw it. He was 7, not oblivious. He could read the words and understand what they meant. His parents saw him wandering around the cave. They called him and told him to stay away from there, not to even think of going inside. But the cave itself was louder than the sign and the words of his parents. Even from several feet away, Mateo could feel the cave on his face, damp and ancient, and completely unlike the warm afternoon around him. He stood at the entrance for a moment and felt the pull of the place the way children feel things, completely, without arguing against it. His parents were behind him, not far, caught up in a brief conversation between themselves. He looked back once, and then as soon as he saw an opportunity, he walked in. At first, it wasn't even that scary. The cave was cool and dark, and the walls were close. But Mateo kept moving forward, letting his eyes adjust, listening to the sound of dripping water somewhere deeper inside. He was the kind of kid who asked questions constantly. Why is this? How does that work? What's in there? And right now, every instinct he had was telling him to go further and find out. The daylight behind him shrank as he moved. First it was the size of a doorway, then a window. Then he turned a corner in the rock and it was just gone. Total darkness. The kind where you hold your hand in front of your face and see absolutely nothing. The darkness that replaced it was unlike anything he had experienced. It was not the darkness of a bedroom or a closed closet. It was total, absolute, the complete absence of light. He got scared and turned around to go back. His foot caught on something he hadn't seen, and then he dropped. It wasn't a huge drop, maybe 3 or 4 feet, but he landed hard on stone, knee, and both palms hitting the ground. He lay there for a second, just processing what happened. Then he got up and felt the walls around him. Smooth rock on all sides, higher than he could reach. He tried jumping. He tried pushing against the walls. He called out and his voice bounced off the cave and came back to him. And that was it. He was stuck in a hole in the dark and he couldn't get out. That's when the panic set in. Mateo sat down on the cave floor and cried. Not a little. Full-on crying, calling out, yelling for help into the dark. But the cave is deep enough that sound doesn't carry well, and nobody heard him. Just the dripping water, over and over, completely indifferent to the fact that a 7-year-old was sitting in a hole 20 feet away. The cold started getting to him pretty quickly, too. Outside, it was a mild March afternoon in the Texas Hill Country. Inside the cave, it was a different story. The temperature dropped significantly once you're in there, and Mateo was in a t-shirt. He started shivering, and it got worse the longer he sat there. He pressed himself into the corner of the hole, folded his arms across his chest, and tried to keep warm, which wasn't really working. He kept calling out. Every few minutes he'd shout as loud as he could, and then go quiet and listen. Nothing came back except the echo of his own voice. He was in the dark. He was cold. He had no idea how long he'd been down there, and he had no way to get himself out. At some point, he started thinking about his parents, his mom's face, his dad. He thought about the sign outside the cave that he'd ignored. That probably stung a little differently now. Back outside, things were moving fast. His parents had realized he was gone somewhere around 1 in the afternoon. His dad told a park ranger he thought Mateo might have gone into the cave. The kid had been looking at it, and knowing his son, that was enough. The Llano County Sheriff's Office got the call. Park rangers started searching Echo Canyon and the surrounding area. More resources were put on standby. It had been a long time since anyone had seen him, and now there was a full search underway for a missing 7-year-old somewhere on Enchanted Rock. His parents waited near the cave entrance. There's not much else you can do in that situation except stand there and hope the next person who comes around the corner is your kid. Meanwhile, Mateo was still in the hole. He'd been down there for close to an hour at this point. The shivering hadn't stopped. He'd worn himself out crying and was just sitting quietly now, still calling out every few minutes, but not really knowing if it was doing anything. The dark was the same as it had been from the beginning. Total, complete, not getting any easier to sit in. Then he heard footsteps. The kid was so traumatized that even the steps made him even more scared. The steps came from further inside the cave, not from the entrance. Mateo kept quiet, trying to hide from whoever those step sounds were coming from. He then saw a faint glow of light and could hear someone calling out. He heard voices getting louder. A group of visitors had been making their way through the cave with headlamps when they picked up the sound of a kid crying out loud. They moved towards the hole. Mateo mustered all his courage and responded back. The group quickly tracked down his voice and found him. They saw a 7-year-old boy sitting in a hole in the cave floor, shivering, alone. These were complete strangers. Under any other circumstance, Mateo would have known not to go with people he didn't know. But he'd been in the dark for an hour, he was freezing, and he couldn't get out on his own. When they reached down, he reached back up. They lifted him out of the hole, put a jacket around him, and walked him toward the exit. He stayed close the whole way. When the light from the cave entrance started showing ahead of them, growing wider and brighter, and then the full afternoon sun hit him. That was it. He was out. Mateo walked out of Enchanted Rock Cave at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, exactly 1 hour after he'd gone in. His parents were right there. No serious injuries, just some scrapes from the fall and a kid who was pretty shaken up and very cold. He told the rangers what had happened. He'd gone in, he'd fallen into a hole he couldn't see, he couldn't climb out, and he'd been stuck until the group found him and lifted him out. The other visitors who had helped him had already been flagged by rangers at the cave entrance. Another hiker had run into them inside and passed word up the chain that the missing boy had been located. The whole thing lasted 1 hour. For a 7-year-old alone in the dark in a hole underground, that's a long time to leave them traumatized. There are places in the world that look like invitations. Kilsby's Hole was one of them, a sinkhole of extraordinary clarity sitting quietly in the South Australian landscape. Its water so impossibly blue and transparent that from above it looked almost artificial, like something placed there rather than formed. Divers had been coming to it for years, drawn by that clarity, by the cavern system that opened beneath the surface, like a secret the earth was only half hiding. It was beautiful in the way that certain dangerous things are beautiful, completely and without apology. Brett and Patrick were 18 years old. They had only been diving for a short time. That distinction matters more than it might seem. The two of them had driven down to Mount Gambier that weekend, with a group of friends, 10 people in total, a loose and easy mix of scuba divers, snorkelers, and non-diving friends along for the trip. Among them were George and Carrie. George had dived with Brett and Pat in the same sinkhole the day before, though he'd been forced to surface early with ear problems. The other two had gone deep without him, all the way to 55 meters, and had come up fine, buzzing with the particular confidence that a successful dive produces in young men who have not yet learned the difference between surviving something and understanding it. They had gotten to bed late that night after a dance. They arrived at the sinkhole at 11 a.m. The plan, as they described it to the group, was to descend to around 60 meters and scratch their names into the cave wall. It sounds almost too simple to be dangerous. Two teenagers wanting to leave their mark somewhere. the way teenagers always do. But let that sink in for a moment. They were planning to descend 6 stories below the surface, into a pitch-black cavern system they had visited exactly once, with single air cylinders, no watches, more lead weight than they needed, and their objective at the bottom was to find a wall and carve their names into it. No urgency. No plan for how long it would take. Just 2 young men who had done the deep dive once before and decided that was enough of a qualification to do it again, deeper, with less equipment and more ambition. George, who had spent more time in the water than either of them, told them directly, "Don't go too deep." They thanked him and went anyway. After a round of surface photos in the main lake, smiling, easy, completely unhurried, Brett and Pat entered the water and began their descent, pulling one end of a 50-meter safety rope down with them, while a companion held the other end at the surface. Carrie watched from above as they dropped through the blue, growing smaller until they touched down on the silted slope at around 28 meters. She watched them pause, tie their end of the rope to a large boulder, and then turn and move horizontally into the vast cavern that opened to the southwest. The safety line went taut. The surface end was released so they could pull it in behind them as they went deeper. The cavern swallowed them, and they were gone from sight. The deeper you go underwater, the quieter the world becomes. Not peaceful quiet. Something heavier than that. The kind of quiet that presses against you, that reminds you with every meter of descent exactly how far you are from air, from light, from anything familiar. Brett and Patrick moved through it with their torches cutting pale beams through water, so clear it almost didn't look like water. The cavern walls rising and falling around them in the dark. The silt below, undisturbed and soft. They passed 30 meters, then 40. And somewhere in that descent, without either of them feeling it happen, nitrogen narcosis began to set in. This is the part that makes cave diving at depth so extraordinarily dangerous for the inexperienced. Narcosis does not feel like impairment. It doesn't arrive with warning signs or alarm bells. It settles in like warmth, like a quiet loosening of everything that usually keeps you sharp and careful. It makes the dark feel less serious. It makes the depth feel manageable. It makes the air supply feel like something you have plenty of, even when you don't. Experienced divers know to watch for it, to check themselves, to compensate. Brett and Patrick had been diving for a short time. They had no watches. They had no way of knowing how long they had been down, or how much air they had burned through getting there. They kept going deeper. At some point, and it is impossible to say exactly when, exactly where in that cavern, one of them took a breath and felt the resistance that no diver ever wants to feel. The slight, unmistakable tightening of a cylinder running low. The air coming harder than it should. In open water, in daylight, with a clear path to the surface. This is serious. In a cavern, in the dark. Past 50 meters, overweighted, with narcosis already softening the edges of every decision. It is something else entirely. The torch beams swung. The silt below them began to lift in small clouds as their fins moved faster, less controlled. Pat's mask came loose, or was pulled off, the way hands go to faces when panic takes over, and the body stops listening to the mind. His torch, his knife. Equipment shed in the dark, the way drowning people shed everything that isn't air. Brett's cylinder was emptying fast, the twin hose regulator drawing down the last of what he had. The cavern that had felt navigable 60 seconds ago now felt enormous. The entrance somewhere behind them, in a direction that the narcosis and the panic and the burning in their lungs made suddenly very hard to locate with certainty. The water around them was perfectly clear, perfectly still, completely indifferent to what was happening inside it. Their torches were still on, still throwing light across the limestone walls of a cavern 60 meters below the surface on a Sunday morning in April, while their friends floated above them in the blue, not yet knowing that anything had gone wrong. At the surface, George had been preparing to follow them down. By the time he finished tying his camera to the rope ladder, the safety line had already vanished, pulled in behind them as they moved deeper into the cavern. He descended anyway, reaching 30 meters, finding the boulder, finding their line tied exactly where Carrie had watched them tie it. Beyond the boulder, the cavern opened into dark water, and George stared into it and saw nothing. No torchlight, no movement. He waited. 5 minutes passed. Nothing came back out of the dark. George surfaced, spoke to Carrie, and neither of them said what they were both thinking. He went back down immediately, switching on to his reserve air as he reached 30 meters, following the line to the boulder again, staring into the same black water. His own air was running low now. He turned to go up. Something caught the corner of his eye, a glint. 10 meters to the left of the main line, deep in the body of the chamber. Something small and steady in the dark. He swam toward it and recognized it as a torch. And as he drew closer, the light illuminated what was around it. And George understood before his mind had finished forming the thought. Brett was lying on his back on the cave floor. Patrick was a couple of meters away. Neither of them moved. The water around them was completely undisturbed. Their torches were still glowing, still casting quiet light across the silt, across the limestone, across the two 18-year-olds who had arrived at the sinkhole that morning with a camera and a safety rope and plans to scratch their names into a wall. George turned and kicked hard for the surface, arriving just as his air ran out. He told the others what he had seen. There was nothing any of them could do. They climbed out of the hole and went for help. 3 hours later, a diver with 6 years of experience went down and brought them up. Everything was noted carefully before anything was moved. The position of the bodies, the state of the equipment, the torches still glowing on the cave floor 60 meters below the surface. Brett's cylinder was completely empty. Patrick's gear was scattered, mask gone, torch gone, knife gone, one fin missing, weight belt still buckled at his waist. The coroner's inquest, held the following month, recorded the cause of death. They had gone too deep, stayed too long, and run out of air in the dark. They were 18 years old. They had been diving for a short time, and Kilsby's hole was still that same impossible blue when they brought them out. Still beautiful, still clear, completely unchanged by what had happened inside it. Some places don't need to acknowledge what they take. May 14th, 1995. It started as an afternoon outing. No ambitious expedition, no deep technical dive into an unmapped system. Just 4 young men on an afternoon in Iowa, walking into Hunter's Cave for a few hours of casual exploring. Neil Kreider was 19. His friend Lucas Thompson was 18. Neil's older brother Charles was 21. And Andy Cornwell, also 21, was the one who had recently come home from military service and had, at some point between his discharge and this particular afternoon, decided to keep a smoke grenade as a souvenir. Nobody asked him about it on the walk in. Nobody noticed the weight of it in his pocket. They just approached the entrance together, and what they saw first was not a grand opening in the earth, but a low, tight mouth in the rock. The kind of entrance that requires you to get on your hands and knees and commit before the cave decides whether it will let you in. They crawled. One by one, each of them dropped to the ground and pushed into the entrance passage, the limestone scraping close on either side, the ceiling inches above their backs. It is a particular kind of commitment, crawling into a cave. There is a moment in every tight entrance where the outside world disappears behind you and the rock closes in from all directions, and the only way that makes psychological sense is forward. They move forward, maybe 10 feet, maybe 15, the passage holding them low and tight, and then the ceiling began to rise. Gradually at first, then enough to matter, the rock pulling back overhead as the passage opened into a wider chamber just beyond the entrance crawl. One by one, they came up off their hands and knees, straightening into a crouch, their backs still bent against the low ceiling, but their legs under them now. They were maybe 20 feet inside the cave. They were still close enough to the entrance to see the faint gray light of the outside world bleeding in through the crawl behind them. They were, by any reasonable measure, barely in at all. That is where Cornwell pulled the pin. Whether he said anything first, whether there was a grin, a warning, some announcement of what was about to happen, the accounts don't preserve it. What they preserve is the result. The grenade detonated in that low, crouched chamber, with all 4 of them gathered in it. The ceiling still only a few feet overhead, the walls close on every side, and the smoke came with a speed and violence that none of them were prepared for. Military smoke grenades are engineered for open terrain, for fields and distances and open sky where the smoke can expand outward in every direction and thin itself against the atmosphere. In that chamber, with a ceiling just above their heads and walls within arm's reach, and only a tight crawl passage connecting them to the outside world, there was nowhere for the smoke to go except everywhere at once. It hit the ceiling and came back down. It hit the walls and folded inward. It filled the chamber from floor to ceiling in seconds, and the fumes came with it. Not just the visual obscurity of the smoke, but the chemical byproducts of the grenade's combustion, compounds with no business inside a human airway, concentrating rapidly in a space too small and too sealed to dilute them. Neil Kreider took a breath and felt his lungs revolt. He was already crouched, already confined, already unable to stand fully upright, and now the smoke was pressing against his eyes and sealing them with tears, and his flashlight beam dissolved 3 feet in front of him into a featureless gray wall. He called out and heard coughing from somewhere close. His brother, he thought, or Lucas, the sound bouncing off the low ceiling, and the walls until direction became meaningless. He tried to move toward the sound, and the ceiling caught his back and reminded him he could not stand, could not run, could not do anything faster than a hunched scramble in any direction. The entrance was behind him somewhere, the crawl passage, the tight 10 or 15 feet of low rock that had brought them in. But behind him had become a concept rather than a location, and the smoke was still thickening, and every breath was pulling more of the grenade's chemistry deeper into his chest. And the chamber that had felt like a relief after the crawl, the first place they had been able to almost stand, had become a sealed box filling with poison. In those moments, he believed he was going to die in there. Cornwell got out first. He found the crawl entrance by feel or by the faint suggestion of outside light bleeding through the haze, dropped back to his hands and knees, and pushed through the tight passage to the daylight on the other side. He came out coughing, straightened up, and stood there for a moment, breathing open air with his hands on his knees. His friends were still inside, still crouched in that low chamber, still breathing what the grenade had made of the air in there. He looked at the stream running nearby and did the only thing available to him. Dropped to his knees at the water's edge, pulled his shirt over his head, soaked it through, wrung it just enough to hold its shape, and pressed it against his face. Then he turned back toward the cave entrance, got down on his hands and knees, and crawled back in. The smoke hit him immediately, even through the wet fabric, even this close to the entrance. He moved forward through the crawl with his face pressed into the soaked shirt, the ceiling scraping his back, the passage giving him no room to hurry. Nothing to do but keep pushing forward inch by inch while the smoke thickened around him and his friends somewhere ahead of him were running out of time. He broke through into the chamber and called out and made contact, first by sound, then by touch, a hand grabbing back at him in the dark, and he pulled, gathered, found another, the chain of them forming in the blackness of that low crouch space, each of them holding the one behind with the grip of people who understand that letting go is the end of the story. They turned toward the entrance. They got down. They crawled, all 4 of them, back through the tight entrance passage, flat to the ground, the ceiling inches above them, the smoke chasing them through the narrowest part of the cave, where there was no room to do anything but move forward or stop. And stopping was not an option. The passage that had taken them maybe 30 seconds to crawl through on the way in felt entirely different on the way out. Longer, tighter, the rock closer on all sides, each of them fighting the compulsion to stop and cough and rest, because every instinct in a body being poisoned is to conserve energy and wait. And waiting on the inside of that crawl meant dying on the inside of that crawl. They moved anyway. The faint gray light of the entrance grew in the haze ahead of them, and then it was not faint anymore. And then the rock opened up and the outside air hit them, and they came out of the earth one by one onto the ground in the May afternoon light. Their bodies made the decision for them. All four of them went down, and the vomiting started almost immediately. The body's oldest mechanism for purging what it cannot process, working without pause on the chemistry of the grenade's combustion that had made it into their bloodstreams. They lay on the ground outside the cave entrance and retched, and the fresh air moved around them, and three of them began, slowly and miserably, to stabilize. Charles Kreider did not. His breathing was wrong in a way that didn't improve as the minutes passed and the others began to find their feet. Not just the ragged, effortful breathing of someone recovering from smoke. Something worse, his airways constricting, his oxygen exchange compromised at a level the open air alone could not correct. The color of him and the sound of him told the others what they needed to know. They got him up, they found a nearby store, got to a phone, and made the call. The ambulance came, and Charles was taken directly to intensive care, his respiratory system requiring intervention that does not happen on the side of a road. All four of them were treated for smoke inhalation. Charles recovered, so did the others. Neil Kreider told a reporter afterward that he wouldn't mind going caving again someday, just probably not with Andy. It is the kind of line that reads easily in a newspaper, dry and human and true, but underneath it is the full weight of what that afternoon actually was. November 17th, 2003. It started as just another adventure. Michael Gingerich, a Maui resident, had gathered 4 other men that afternoon to do something that drew thrill seekers to the Big Island all the time: crawl into the earth itself. The Hana Highway corridor near Kailua, Hawaii, sits over one of the most geologically active landscapes on the planet. A place where ancient lava once carved hollow tunnels deep beneath the surface as it drained toward the sea thousands of years ago. These tubes, some stretching hundreds of feet, nearly 30 meters or more, beneath the surface, had become informal destinations for spelunkers, underground explorers, grotto enthusiasts, and curiosity-driven hikers looking to experience something raw and completely unlike anything above ground. There's something deeply compelling about lava tubes specifically. They aren't like limestone caves carved slowly by water over millions of years. They were formed fast, violently, by molten rock moving at speed, leaving behind tunnels that feel almost alien. Smooth in some places, jagged in others, with walls that still carry the memory of fire inside them. Gingerich and his group were drawn to exactly that kind of experience. They weren't reckless people, they were adventurous people. And on that particular Tuesday afternoon, the 5 men climbed down into the darkness of an unspecified lava tube just off the Hana Highway, not knowing that the world above them was about to change in the most terrifying way imaginable. Hawaii's weather does not negotiate. It doesn't warn you politely or give you time to reconsider your plans. One moment the sky can be open and humid, the trade winds keeping everything comfortable, and the next, a rainstorm can materialize with the kind of speed and outright violence that feels almost personal. That's exactly what happened while Gingerich and the others were underground, moving through the dark in their own little world, completely unaware of what was building above them. A sudden, severe rainstorm swept through the area and unleashed a flash flood with almost no warning. Rainwater, with nowhere to go on the hardened, impermeable volcanic landscape, funneled rapidly downhill and found the path of least resistance. It found the cave entrance. Within a terrifyingly short window of time, a large and powerful stream had formed and was pouring directly into the mouth of the lava tube, completely flooding the only way in, and more critically, the only way out. The exit was gone, sealed by nature itself, not with rock or earth, but with moving, rushing, unstoppable water. Imagine being in a narrow tunnel carved by ancient fire, hearing a roar of water building somewhere behind you, feeling the air pressure change, and realizing with absolute clarity that you are sealed inside the earth. That is the exact moment Gingeric and his group faced. Two of the men, including Gingeric himself, made a split-second, desperate decision. They submerged themselves into the churning, freezing floodwater and physically dragged their way through the flooded entrance, fighting the current with every ounce of strength they had. They made it. They emerged soaked, shaking, gasping for breath on the surface, but alive and free. The other three men were not so fortunate. Whether the water rose too fast, the current became too powerful too quickly, or fear held them in place just a moment too long, the three remaining underground explorers could not force themselves through that flooded entrance. The three men had no option but to turn back. They retreated deeper into the lava tube, moving away from the water and further into the dark. And just like that, three men were entombed underground inside a Hawaiian volcanic cave with no visible exit, and floodwater continuing to pour in from above with no sign of stopping. Fire and rescue personnel received the distress call and arrived at the scene shortly after 4 o'clock in the afternoon. What greeted them was a grim picture. The cave entrance, which would normally be a passable opening, was completely swallowed by the floodwater, churning and opaque, giving away nothing. There was no sign of the three trapped men, no voices carried through the noise of the rushing water, no lights flickered from below, no indication whatsoever of whether the men were close to the entrance, whether the current had dragged them further into the tube's interior, or whether something irreversible had already occurred. The uncertainty alone was its own kind of horror. But the situation was even more complicated than that, because as rescuers were assessing the cave, they were informed about another distress call. Roughly 24 stranded hikers, including several young children, were also stuck far from the cave. They were hiking near a trail and were pinned on the far side of the flooded stream, completely cut off from the trail and unable to return to safety on their own. They somehow managed to climb a cliff and remained there. What had begun as a missing person situation was now a multi-front emergency playing out simultaneously in the fading Hawaiian afternoon. With daylight burning down fast, only a few hours of usable light remaining, the rescue teams faced a decision no one wanted to make. The cave entrance, still roaring with aggressive floodwater, was judged far too dangerous to attempt any kind of underwater entry. The current was brutal, the visibility inside was essentially zero, and the risk of a trained rescuer being swept into the tube, or worse, becoming trapped themselves, was simply not an acceptable gamble. Compounding the problem was the fact that nobody on the surface knew exactly how far into the lava tube the three men had retreated. Sending a diver blindly through a flooded, pitch-black entrance of an unknown length underground passage would not be a rescue attempt. It would be sending a fourth person into a potential grave. And so, with the clock ticking, the decision was made to prioritize the stranded hikers visible on the surface. A helicopter equipped with a rescue basket was deployed and began making slow, careful passes, lifting the trapped group, 2 people at a time, adults, children, one tense flight after another, from the far side of the flooded stream to a designated landing zone near the highway. It was painstaking, methodical work, but it moved people from danger to safety, one pair at a time. By 10 o'clock that night, however, official rescue operations for the 3 missing cavers were suspended until morning. The reasoning wasn't callous. Operating in complete darkness with floodwater still actively running strong into the cave was judged too dangerous for rescue personnel to continue safely. First light would bring better conditions and better options. That was the official stance. But the friends and family members who had gathered at that cave entrance were not operating on official stances. They were operating on love and refusal. They drove to a nearby store, bought flashlights and bought glow sticks. Simple, cheap, chemical light sticks of the kind you'd hand a child at a Halloween parade. And they came straight back to that cave and refused to leave. What happened next is one of those moments that feels almost too quietly human to belong in a disaster story. The friends cracked open those glow sticks and threw them into the water flowing into the cave entrance. They tossed glowing tubes of cold green and yellow light into a flooded volcanic tunnel and waited under the dark sky. And almost immediately, Almost instantly, from somewhere deep inside the earth, they heard yelling. The three trapped spelunkers, who had now spent hours underground in complete darkness listening to water and wondering if anyone was ever coming, heard the splash, saw the glow moving in the water below them, and screamed back with everything they had left. They were alive, they were uninjured, but the water was still too high and too dangerous to attempt an exit, so they waited. Their families called into the dark from above, keeping the connection alive through the roar of the flood. And slowly, over the next several hours, the water dropped, the stream thinned, the entrance reappeared. After approximately 9 hours trapped underground in a volcanic lava tube, the three men walked out of the earth and stood in the night air, completely unharmed. 9 hours underground, no dive team, no specialized equipment, no heroic underwater rescue. Just 3 men in the dark, holding on, and a handful of people on the surface who weren't willing to stop looking. And a few glow sticks. That's what brought them home. Sometimes the most extraordinary part of a survival story isn't the disaster, it's the glow stick.